How the people are doing? So, well, it is time for us to check out the video capabilities of the OnePlus 10 Pro compared to the S22 Ultra. Now, I must say, this is gonna be very interesting. I would arguably say that this is gonna be better than the photography comparison that I did a little while back. You can check it out using the link in the description. But yeah, this is gonna be a fun one, so let's jump right in. So here we have the selfie video from both phones. And well, I think, in our lives we have heard at least at some point that the numbers don't always indicate everything about a camera. But I think this case here, between these two phones, this might be an exception because basically 4K on the S22 Ultra, it just looks better. There's really no two ways about that. If you have seen any of my previous camera comparisons with either the OnePlus 9 Pro or even before that when Samsung had 4K, I think we've had 4K on the selfie cameras for Samsung flagships for a very long time. Not the case on the OnePlus, of course. But yeah, at least far as I can tell, the highlights are better preserved on the S22, and I think generally it's going to look better on the S22. Now then, both of these phones can also do portrait video, and I do think that the maximum amount of blur that you can get is higher on the OnePlus 10 Pro right here. But once again, the HDR, at least on the viewfinder, it looks better on the S22 Ultra. Now, for the most part, I don't think there's going to be too much of a difference, especially in like edge detection, because I know for a fact that they're going to be good, but they're not going to end up being exceptional or perfect, because that's really the big problem with portrait video. If it's not perfect, you can very easily tell that it looks fake, and it just breaks the illusion entirely. It's different from portrait mode photos, because here it needs to be consistently exceptional, and that's not really the case for anything. Alright, so I'm basically gonna stand by what I just said in the video itself, because I do believe the S22 looks far better, at least to my eyes, undeniably so. Basically, the skin tones look better, the contrast is really well balanced considering the lighting, which was pretty difficult to begin with, but that's the whole point of a comparison, right? But I do think that the audio is far closer than I thought it would be. Basically, the OnePlus is louder and it has a lot more background noise coming in, while the S22 has less background noise, but is just comparatively a little bit more muffled. Now, honestly, I'll pick the S22 because I just prefer the less background noise there, but I still think audio is pretty close in both. And as for portrait video, essentially you're going to be stuck at 1080p on the S22 as well as the OnePlus 10 Pro, so be prepared to lose out on some pretty serious amount of quality right there. And I mean, it looks good on the S22. It's not perfect. As I said, there are a lot of areas where the blur didn't quite work out. Up next, we have 4K video on both. And yeah, at this point, I think it's pretty obvious that when we have flagships in good daylight and in 4K video with the main cameras, it's going to look extremely nice. And it does. There are fundamental differences with higher contrast and more general vibrance on the OnePlus 10 Pro. That said, I do like the colors on the OnePlus here. It's very natural despite being very vibrant, and honestly, the higher contrast, you all know me, it speaks to me and I prefer it. But I could see quite easily a lot of people siding with the S22 for having a much more neutral tone to the entire video itself. Next up, for 4K Ultrawide, I'd say it's pretty close. I do think there are a few more jerks that are making it into the OnePlus 10 Pro's video compared to the S22 at least, and the details are definitely sharper on the S22. We have a details test coming soon, so don't go anywhere yet. But yeah, otherwise, the rest of the differences are basically the same as the ones we saw in the previous shot. Now, I wanted to see dynamic range on both phones, and this was during high noon, so a very, very harsh condition right here. And I would say both are pretty good with the dynamic range. The S22 has lower contrast, more shadow detail. That's to be expected, but the magenta in the sky on the OnePlus 10 Pro, that honestly doesn't look good. And that's precisely the reason why I'm going to go with the S22, at least in this case. Now, OnePlus does have an AI highlights mode, supposed to enhance the dynamic range, and it is limited to the main camera, but more importantly, it is also limited to 1080p, so definitely less sharpness and overall detail on the OnePlus. I mean, it's pretty visible to me. I don't know how much you're gonna see it on YouTube, but the difference is there, trust me when I say it. That said, the dynamic range is basically same across the board. The color of the green is a little off on the OnePlus. S22 is much more natural, but that said, on the S22 you get this dynamic range by default, and you can use it with the ultrawide camera and all that. in 4K, so that definitely makes the S22 better for dynamic range in general. Now HDR10 Plus on the other hand, we do have that on the OnePlus 10 Pro finally. Now you do have to go to movie mode to use this feature, which is kind of cumbersome, and you have this lock with the 21:9 aspect ratio. But that said, it's nice to have the feature finally. And honestly, the transcoded versions don't look very good on the OnePlus 10 Pro. I think the S22 looks much better with the contrast and exposure and all that. And you can use all of the lenses on the S22 as well. So I think it just wins just because of all the versatility right there. Now up next, we had a focusing test right here. Now what surprises me is that the S22 is faster than the OnePlus 10 Pro. Now that is something I expected, but when it comes to consistently focusing on a close-up subject, the OnePlus was actually doing a better job. As you can see, the leaves were moving around a lot, and the S22, for some very odd reason, it kept focusing on the background, but the OnePlus made sure to keep focus on the subject much longer than the S22 did, so that definitely gives it a win right there. But then we have the S22 Ultra, which comes in with all of its versatility, because we can go from the ultrawide to the main camera to the 3x zoom and then finally to 10x zoom. Now don't walk around with 10x zoom, you're not gonna get any stabilization whatsoever, but you do have the option, and the S22 is probably one of the only flagships that has this feature. So yeah, the S22 is exceptional with versatility, while on the OnePlus you can't even use a 3x zoom because you don't get 4K with it, and in my opinion it's just not worth the sacrifice in resolution and the quality of the video you're gonna get just for a 3x optical zoom. Next up, we have 4K 60 on both. Now a lot of the differences we saw in 4K 30 are translated here as well. Now I must say the contrast on the S22 definitely looks a little bit higher compared to the 4K 30 versions, and the OnePlus still looks really nice with the colors and everything, and the main camera 4K 60, it looks really close and really good on both. But the reason I'm going to say that the S22 takes it for 4K 60 is that it can do 4K 60 with all of its cameras. That includes the ultrawide, and that's honestly the most important camera here, because you can get beautiful smooth 4K 60 with the ultrawide field of view and the stabilization that comes with it, and you can slow it down if you want. The benefits are very obvious, and we all know how good ultrawide 4K 60 can look, as you can see. Now next up, we have super steady on both. Now the S22 does use the ultrawide camera, so you get a slightly wider field of view, and I think just a few less jerks. It's a minor difference in the stabilization department, while the OnePlus, despite being in the same resolution, because it's using the main camera here, it definitely has more detail and less over sharpening. I think that's the biggest difference here. So my preference does go to the OnePlus, but I think it's important for everybody to know that the OnePlus 9 Pro from last year, it had 4K 30 super stable, and I'm not sure why, but we don't have that feature anymore either. There's been a lot of features that have been completely cut out on the OnePlus 10 Pro, but regardless, let's talk about 8K. So I think OnePlus has better general 8K video because you have a much wider field of view, and along with that, slightly better stabilization compared to the S22 Ultra as well. And well, that's essentially where it ends, because yes, on the main camera the OnePlus is exceptionally good with 8K, and the S22, because of the huge resolution, has to crop in a lot more, but we cannot use the ultrawide 8K that we could last year anymore. You see what I'm talking about when I say that there are a lot of features that have been removed. 8K 30 on the ultrawide, it was the best on the OnePlus 9 Pro, and now we don't even have the feature on the OnePlus 10 Pro. Now we're gonna test out details by zooming in at 500%, this time with 4K on the main cameras. And in case you're wondering why the conditions are so crazy, well, because I did take a normal 4K 30 with the main camera in good lighting, and the differences were very minor, so I just thought, let's throw them in a slightly adverse lighting condition, and if they can perform well here, well, they're gonna perform really well when you take a video. So zooming in, the S22 was giving us far more shadow detail to begin with, and what's really surprising here is that the OnePlus has more grain despite the fact that it is crushing the shadows, which is obviously not ideal. You'd want less grain on the OnePlus 10 Pro. After all, it is giving you less shadow detail. But the one good thing about the OnePlus is that it has far less over sharpening, and that's definitely something I prefer. The natural look of the video, despite the fact that we're cropping into 500%. I definitely like that on the OnePlus, but in general I think the S22 is just gonna take a win here. Now on the ultrawide camera, I mean, it's no surprise that the S22 Ultra is taking a win, despite the fact that from a technical standpoint, the OnePlus 10 Pro does have a superior sensor, but it does lose out on a lot of detail, which makes it very similar in detail preservation compared to the S22, but the S22 has far less grain and noise. So that's the reason I think the S22 takes a win. Now 8K on the other hand, this is pretty interesting to say the very least, because initially it looks pretty good, but once we zoom in, that's a ton of haloing on the OnePlus 10 Pro. I didn't really expect that, to be honest. Like the S22 on the other hand, extremely natural. Like it's really good on the S22. Yes, both have their fair share of grain and noise, obviously, but the amount of detail you're getting on the OnePlus, it looks very oversharpened and very artificial compared to the very natural look on the S22, and I think it's pretty obvious that my preference is gonna go to the S22 as well. Now nighttime video on both phones, it's very similar to the differences we saw in normal 4K 30, because there's a ton of contrast on the OnePlus 10 Pro, a slightly more vibrant look as well. I do think that the OnePlus, because it's crushing shadows, is going to give you slightly less noise in those crushed areas, while the S22 on the other hand, and it's a similar story in the ultrawide in case you're wondering, you're going to get more detail in the shadows but also slightly higher amount of grain. Now which you want, that's going to depend entirely on you, and to be honest, the ultrawide video on both, it's not a very pretty video to begin with. Now moving on though, we have 1080p 240 slow motion on both, and yes, of course it looks really nice and everything. There was a little bit of flickering going on, but regardless, I think the problem on the OnePlus 10 Pro is that it just would not focus on the lighter. The S22 had zero problems, like I didn't even have to tap to focus on it, it just did the job, got it done and no problems whatsoever. The OnePlus, I had to tap to focus about 20 times until it finally got it done, and even right now I don't think it's focusing enough. Either that or the detail preservation in 1080p 240 is just terrible compared to the S22 Ultra on the OnePlus. Because whatever the case, at least in this sample, the S22 is doing a far better job. But that said, 1080p 240 is not the only thing the OnePlus can do. And yes, despite the huge amount of complaints and the large number of features that are gone on the OnePlus, I mean, I'm still glad that we have 4K 120. And this is one of the only phones in the world that can do 4K 120, and it's still an incredible feature, and it manages to blow my mind every single time I use it. Honestly, I'm surprised that more phones don't actually use 4K 120, because clearly basically every single flagship that has come out last year and is gonna come out this year, including the S22 Ultra, are capable of producing 4K 120. I'm just not sure why it's not being implemented yet. But that said, this is the end of the video comparison, and had OnePlus not removed all of these features like 4K 60 ultrawide, 8K 30 ultrawide, and then the detail preservation in ultrawide video in general not being very good, all that stuff, had OnePlus not removed all of them, and also 4K 30 super stable. You see, there are a lot of features that have been removed, and had that not happened, I would have said that there is a major audience out there for the OnePlus 10 Pro's camera as a videography tool compared to the S22 Ultra. But right now, in this situation, I would quite easily say that the S22 Ultra is just going to give you better results. It is in general much better compared to the OnePlus 10 Pro's videography and what it can offer. I mean, sure, sometimes the OnePlus 10 Pro pulls ahead, but it's such a small difference most of the time that it really doesn't matter much. And yes, I understand, higher price tag on the S22 Ultra, but you gotta keep in mind the S22 has a lot more features compared to the OnePlus 10 Pro as a smartphone, and the camera is just a very small part of it. But as it stands right now, I damn well hope that the OnePlus 10 Ultra, whenever it comes out, it blows everything out the water, because the OnePlus 10 Pro, it's really not cutting it with the camera department. So with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, do hit that like button, subscribe if you're not ready, and I will be seeing you guys later. Cheers.